The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed.
Hello and welcome to Tower Junkies, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. Tower Junkies is a podcast devoted to the Dark Tower series by Stephen King, in which we discuss the themes, characters, and mythology of the series in Palaver episodes, and review the books and comic series in Kef episodes. We also discuss non-Tower King novels, TV and film adaptations of King's work, and the latest news about potential Dark Tower-related adaptations and merchandise, and really anything about Stephen King and the Dark Tower that we can sit here and talk for an hour or so about at any given time. I am your host and, dare I say, din of the podcast, Tony? Because I said it last week.
You're definitely my din.
Okay.
Din. I always want to say dine.
I know.
Am I out now? Am I out of the...
No, you have not. You have not. You are not the... Oh man, what is the word for that? Hang on.
I haven't forgotten the face of my father.
You haven't. You're not the Kames, I think, or Kame. You're not a Kami. No, you're not a Kame, which is a cause fool or destiny's fool.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, for all intents and purposes, I am the din of the podcast. My name is Matt Hurt. You can find me on Twitter at ObsessiveViewer, and you can follow this podcast on Twitter. We actually have a separate Twitter account for this.
Nice.
Yeah, at Tower Junkies Pod. And Tiny, my commate on this, is Tiny. Go ahead and say hi.
Hello, everyone. I am Tiny, also known as Anthony. And my Twitter handle is at ObsessiveTiny.
Yay!
I get on there occasionally.
Yeah. So this is the first, official episode of this podcast that I feel like I kind of just threw this at you, pretty last minute, pretty out of nowhere. And I cry my pardon on that. I'm sorry.
I was expecting it.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the Dark Tower forever, and it's the same thing we did with our other podcast, The Obsessive Viewer.
Right.
We talked about movies all the time, and so we're like, we need to start recording this.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we are talking about the Dark Tower all the time. So I knew we needed to start recording it. It was the will of Gan. So
right.
I knew it was going to happen.
I'm glad that you feel that way, because I made the joke to you the other day that it was like the day after I launched that first introductory episode, I sent you a message saying oh, hey, we officially have this podcast, whether you like it or not. And then I said oh, and I had a dream last night about Lost, so we're going to start a Lost podcast too.
Yeah.
Or I said, I'm going to start a Lost podcast without adequately consulting with you about it. But yeah, so anyway, I was only half joking on that.
Yeah, I told my fiance about it, and she rolled her eyes, but it was only once.
Nice.
So
That's
we're
good.
okay. Yeah.
When you say only one, you mean both eyes once, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, because that would have been weird. But anyway, that's good. You're not mad at me. That's good.
Yes.
Yeah. So for some background, the episode that I kind of threw together for the introductory episode was me just talking about the different types of episodes we're going to have, which you can find a breakdown of on towerjunkies.com, and you'll have a whole look at how we have it broken down and everything. But the last episode I posted was basically me introducing the podcast, and then the 90-minute discussion that you and I had prior to seeing the movie, where we talked about our history with the books and our excitement for the movie and just our general giddiness about it. And I think that that's a good introduction to our dynamic and our shared history with the Dark Tower series. So we don't really need to rehash it, but
yeah.
In kind of brief terms, just go ahead and let us know, I guess, rehash it.
Yeah.
In brief terms, just very brief, talk about your history with the books.
Absolutely. I avoided the series for a long time. I first became a Stephen King fan when I was in junior high, starting with some of his earlier work. And read all his books. I read a ton of his books. Can't imagine anyone reading all of them. But I remember stumbling across The Gunslinger and the Dark Tower series as a teenager, and then I found out there were so many books, and I was just like, I'm not even going to try to tackle that. I did the same thing with It, because it was so long.
Right.
I just avoided it. And so I finally read, we just kind of, I don't even know how we stumbled onto it, or just we kind of, both of us around the same time decided to start reading it.
Oh, I know exactly what it was, but we'll get to that in a second.
7 or 8 years ago. And I just, from there, I was just like, this is great. I'm hooked and I'm in. Read all the books. I haven't read One Through the Keyhole yet. I've read most of the comics. I'm not up to date on them, but, it is just such an incredible universe to throw yourself into. It is Stephen King's Leviathan. It stretches out across all his work, or it seemingly does. Yeah. And so I feel like Stephen King fans need to find their way to this series, because it is like the linchpin of his work, if you will. Absolutely.
And we will definitely get into discussing that with the topic of this episode and everything. And yeah, my history with it that I mentioned in the last episode is that basically, I was more of a casual fan of Stephen King, throughout high school and in my early 20s. It wasn't until I really fell in love with the show Lost that I became more attached to like Stephen King and everything. Not that he had anything to do with Lost. It was just very much, a Stephen King type of show. And so I went ahead and read a bunch of Stephen King. I read several of his books. And then the thing that got us, or at least got me more interested in The Dark Tower, was knowing that Lost was heavily inspired by Stephen King, and that the creators of Lost were fans of The Dark Tower.
That's right.
Yep.
Just because of Man in Black and Lost.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and so when Lost was ending back in May of 2010, I think because at the time, for background for us, Tiny and I have been friends since junior high, and for how long was it? 5, 6, 7 years we worked together.
At least.
Yeah, we worked third shift as security guards for like 7 years. Which is funny because there are a couple other Dark Tower podcasts I listen to, like Dark Tower Palaver and Dark Tower Radio, that like oddly enough, both of those shows have hosts that they worked third shift together and talked about the Dark Tower all the time. Like it's really weird. Yeah. I was like, that's really bizarre, but that's awesome. Both really good shows, by the way. But anyway, nice. So we would basically spend an entire night working as security guards with tons of downtime, just talking about the stuff we were reading and talking about like shows we were watching, and like just having general discussions and everything. And we started talking a lot more about like Stephen King and everything. And then like when Lost was ending, I think one of us was like, well, we should probably give The Dark Tower a try, because neither of us had read it. And then I started it in June of 2010, and then finished it July of 2011. Because I kind of took my time with it. And I think you took around the same amount of time.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I think you actually finished it a few 2 or 3 months before I did, I think. Okay. Because I distinctly remember, and I was super kind of jealous because you posted this very eloquent Facebook post. Like I remember reading it and thinking like, holy shit, yeah, this is the same. Like I feel the same way. But like you had said something like it was after you'd finished it, and you said basically you had this long wall of text where it was basically saying that like Roland Deschain is the most tragic and complex character that Stephen King's ever written, and it's such an amazing work and everything. And like I read that not knowing the context of the ending at the time. And then when I finished reading The Dark Tower, I was like, oh my God, this is like a masterpiece. Like it's freaking brilliant. And yeah, and I felt the exact same way, that it was just Roland Deschain is such a character of such complexity and such nuance that it's just amazing. So that was kind of how we started with The Dark Tower, and how that became such a big part of our lives, as we were just kind of bullshitting at work and then started reading it, and we would discuss it each night at work. And we would talk about it for hours and hours and hours. And like you said, that is a kind of a natural gravitation for us to do a Dark Tower podcast. Which is funny because over the last year and a half, pretty much every episode of The Obsessive Viewer, which is a weekly movie and TV podcast that we host over at obsessiveviewer.com, in the lead up to the movie coming out, we have been talking about that nonstop. And so this is a nice kind of way to let us talk more about the Dark Tower outside of our more broad movie and TV podcast.
Yeah. When I think about it a little bit deeper, we kind of, for me personally, I think I kind of need this because there's no other work, there's no other artist who has carved out at a little corner of my brain, of my thoughts, like Stephen King has with the Dark Tower.
Yes.
Like it occupies, I used to say that I thought about the Dark Tower every day. Like every day I would think something, it would occupy my thoughts for maybe a very insignificant percentage of the day, but I'd still think about it almost every day. And maybe in the past couple of years, 3 years, maybe not as much.
Right.
But there's nothing else art-wise that occupies my thoughts and my energy and my time like the Dark Tower does, and Stephen King in general.
Yeah.
I mean, he's there. Like that's Star Wars is maybe kind of close, but still doesn't. I don't think about Star Wars every day. I never did. It is pervasive. It's like an earworm that worked its way into my brain, or like a bookworm that went through my ear and found its way and has nested in my brain.
Nice.
It's ubiquitous, or it's pervasive for me. It's part of my thoughts on a regular basis. So
I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So we had to do this pretty much.
We did. And it's funny because like obviously, you know me, when I am into something media-wise, when I am into a show, a movie franchise, if I'm into a book series or whatever, I am into it.
You run with it, yeah.
Like it occupies my brain all the time. And with the Dark Tower, that was something that I think part of the reason why I fell so far in love with it was because, and it's something I didn't really put together in my brain until this reread, which is interesting because we went like a 6-7 year span of not reading the books.
Yeah.
And then the lead up to the movie, we reread them. And the whole time I was thinking like, why did I wait this long?
I know.
And it also doesn't feel that long because it was such a strong figment in my mind that it was with me the entire time. But anyway, one of the reasons why I think it stuck with me so clearly is that it is many things. It is a huge amalgam of not only different genres and different types of stories and everything. Like there's a great segment in Wolves of the Kala where, it's a little fuzzy to me, but I think Eddie is talking to Roland about how, about the different types of stories that we have on Earth, like the different some like cops and robbers and cowboys and stuff like that. And then the way that King describes it is it's like I don't know what it is, but it's like Roland says something like, why don't you ever like, it's compared to like food, and he's like, why don't you ever mix the ingredients and stuff? I'm butchering it, but we'll get to that eventually. But anyway, what I love about it is that it's an amalgam of all that, but it's also at its heart, it's this exploration of King's creativity and the way that he, it's the most ingrained and honest kind of look at like an addictive character. And like Roland Deschain is this he's an addict, he's a tower junkie. And it brings such nuance to him. And then like that characterization is just great because it's not like it's not like the prototypical hero character. It's this character who is willing to sacrifice other characters for his goal, but it's not in a malicious or villainous way. It's just like he's got a job to do, and that's just what he's going to do. Mm-hmm. It's a really great way to bring about a character through such a long saga. And I'm one of those people that actually really liked the inclusion of Stephen King, like the different references to different things in the Stephen King multiverse, and actually referencing Stephen King in the series, because it feels like he was dealing with his creativity and injecting his creativity into it in kind of a unique way. And we'll talk more about that later. But yeah, I love that it's not like a straight fantasy series. It's not like a straight science fiction series. It's all of these different things put together and thrown in a blender, and it goes into some really weird places.
Yes.
And yeah, so I think part of the reason why I just fell so deeply in love with it is that it gives me so much more to think about and affects so many different parts of my personality and brain that I'm just in it.
Right.
I'm much deeper in it than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what else do we want to talk about? So this is what's called the Palaver episode, which is just a general episode discussion about the series. And these episodes are designed to have like a set topic for it. A topic relating to the Dark Tower series. So we'll have other episodes that dive into the actual series and dive into adaptations and non-Tower Stephen King properties, stuff like that. But for this episode, this is a Palaver episode. We're just talking about the series as a whole, and we have a topic this week. Do you want to reveal what the topic is? Do you remember how I phrased it?
I do. I think I do. Yeah. Basically, as a Dark Tower fan, you're so enthusiastic about it, and and you'll talk to someone about it, and they will inevitably ask you, well, what's it about?
Right.
That's the most common way that phrase is presented to you. And most of us, us being Dark Tower fans, are like, oh man, where to start?
Right.
Cause it's such a, like you said, it defies genre, and it's character driven, and it's also story driven, and there's just so much involved that it's hard to condense a pitch for this series into a few sentences or a casual conversation.
Right.
It's very difficult to do. And so with this episode, we were going to try to essentially go through how we pitch the series to a prospective reader.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are a couple different levels to this. How we would pitch it to just someone who's interested in reading it and interested in experiencing it. And also, if we want, we can also talk about like pitching it to the casual reader who just thinks that Stephen King is only about horror. And then also I was going to say pitch it to someone who just saw the movie and wants to know what it's all about.
Right.
And I understand, I realize that we're releasing these episodes, like this podcast is launching in the shadow of the movie being released. And we had 2 episodes on the Obsessive Viewer, just talking out our feelings about the movie. So it's all documented there. What I might do is take those 2 episodes and cut them together and rearrange them a little bit and just release them as a big Tower Junkies episode.
Okay.
We'll see, but, suffice it to say, we weren't fans of the movie. We didn't like it. We'll talk more about it in later episodes and everything, and probably do like a commentary track episode if you want to do one.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, so Tiny, and the idea for this episode, or the idea for this topic, reminds me of basically Indie PopCon. A couple months ago, about a month and a half ago, we went to Indie PopCon here in Indianapolis. By the way, we're both in Indianapolis. We didn't mention that. Here in Indianapolis, we went to Indie PopCon for Obsessive Viewer and kind of hawked our podcast and everything. And there were a lot of people there that, we were just talking to, and like we were both like really excited for the movie coming out. So like there was a lot of times where I found myself talking to people about the Dark Tower and explaining to them like, oh, I'm excited for the movie because of these elements of it that are in the trailer, and why I like explaining like why I love this series. I felt really, I thought it was really funny because I went to the Hypable table with the girls from Hypable.com. And like we were talking about, they had just seen Spider-Man Homecoming, and I told them that I was excited for the Dark Tower, and then they said that they had just seen the trailer. And so like I just went into a whole, like I bent their ear for like probably 20 to 25 minutes, just word vomiting all of my feelings about the Dark Tower series to them. So this episode is kind of a, inspired by that. We're going to talk about how we pitch it to people who aren't familiar with it. And how do you like, so yeah. Tiny, what is your like go-to thing? Cause like you see the gunslinger and you think, oh, it's a Western. It's a fantasy Western.
Yeah.
How do you pitch it to people?
I figured out that the first thing I needed to do was ask the person if they are familiar with Stephen King's work, mm-hmm. or if they're fans of Stephen King. Mm-hmm. Because I think Stephen King attracts a certain type of reader, mm-hmm. or a certain type of consumer of stories. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, he's so popular. He's such a ubiquitous author. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows who Stephen King is.
Right.
And everyone's at least quasi-familiar with his work, mm-hmm. that you have different levels of Stephen King fans. You know, there's people like, right. well, you know, I've seen The Shining, but I've never read any of his books. Or, you know, it's like, oh, I thought Carrie was a great movie. Mm-hmm. Very casual fans. And you have people who are like, man, I've read most of his books and I've seen all the movies and stuff like that. It's just such a mixed bag. So I think you have to find out what kind of Stephen King familiarity you're dealing with. I mm-hmm. think that's the first place I always start out with. And I think there's kind of 3 levels to the pitch. Once you find out what kind of fan they are, you can branch off from there. You can say, oh, you know how if they're like, oh, I'm really familiar, I've read a lot of his books and I've seen a lot of the movies and stuff, and I like his stuff. I'm always interested in what he comes out with. You know, a pretty familiar fan. You can say, okay, well, you know how Stephen King always has really great characters and how he always puts them in extraordinary situations. Mm-hmm. This is his best character. This is his ultimate situation. Mm-hmm. And you can go from there. But if you had someone I think if you have someone who has no familiarity with Stephen King whatsoever, you kind of have to pitch Stephen King as an author. Mm-hmm. And I really love to pitch Stephen King as an author because I think most people who just enjoy stories can enjoy Stephen King's writing. Mm-hmm. Because like you said, he kind of gets mislabeled, I would say, as a horror writer.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of his most famous stuff is very scary. Mm-hmm. You know, The Shining and Carrie. Mm-hmm. Those are probably 2 of his most famous works. And those are scary. The Shining is fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
And so but he has so much work that's not necessarily horror. Mm-hmm. And the way I like to describe his stories are that they're extraordinary. Mm-hmm. They take place in extraordinary situations. 'Cause sometimes it's just extreme like action or extreme situations. It's not necessarily that, you know, oh, this ghost is haunting me or, you know, this monster is trying to kill me. Sometimes it's just, you're stuck in a cabin with a crazy lady mm-hmm. who is a super fan of yours and wants to keep you there, which is scary in and of itself, but it's not a monster jumping out of another dimension scary, or you know what I mean? It's not a ghost or a vampire.
Yeah, it's not supernatural.
It's not right. So I feel like he does stories like Under the Dome, which is not horror at all.
Yeah,
and any number of stories. The Tommyknockers is kind of like sci-fi essentially. It's not even. I mean, there are scary situations in it, but it's kind of just sci-fi. And
that one I haven't read Tommyknockers yet, but that's like his kind of from my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of like a love letter to like Invasion of Body Snatchers.
Okay.
Is that?
I haven't read it.
Oh, okay.
But I saw most of the, like, there was a miniseries, I think, with Jimmy Smits.
Really?
Yeah, that I think was kind of awful. I don't think it was a movie. I think it was a miniseries.
Okay, that sounds about right.
But I saw most of it anyway. Anyways,
Yeah.
so I think it's kind of fun to in and of itself just to pitch Stephen King to people, because the way I like to say it is he will take the most ordinary man you can think of, like Stu Redman in The Stand, or the main character in 11/22/63, just an English teacher in Maine.
Yeah.
You know, or
11/22. I mean, that's basically a love story,
right?
Thriller, time travel story.
There's nothing scary about that book.
Yeah.
It's just awesome. It's an adventure.
Oh yeah,
it's an adventure book.
Oh yeah.
You can list 30 characters. They're just a regular dude that you see getting his coffee every morning at the gas station.
Yeah.
But he will throw that person into an incredible situation. There's a vampire haunting this guy's town, or he finds a portal for time travel, or he turns out to be the leader of an entire group of people after the apocalypse. I mean, there's just, and that takes such a relatable situation or such a relatable character and launches them into an incredible story and makes them a really interesting person. He pulls the story out of his characters. That's the coolest thing I think about Stephen King's writing. This is turning into a pitch for Stephen King.
Right.
So I think you pitch Stephen King, and then from there you build up Stephen King, or if someone already knows about Stephen King, you say, this is his magnum opus. This is the linchpin of arguably everything he's ever written. I think if he had the time and the energy, and if he lived to be 200 years old, he would link every single one of his stories to the Dark Tower.
Yeah.
I think in some way they are all inspired by the Tower. So, and you know, literally, that is the idea behind this series, is that the Tower is the axle that all the spokes of the wheel of the universe connect to.
Nice.
And
I like
so,
that.
yeah, it is the nexus of all universes. And so, and then from there you can say, you know, you can just kind of start it there, and then you can say, plus this story has the best character he's ever created. It has plenty of other ancillary supporting characters that are super fascinating and that you will fall in love with. It is 10 genres in one. It jumps between different universes, different time spans. There's monsters. There's robots. There's lightsabers. It's a Western. Like
Paradoxes.
Yes.
It
has
demons.
It has magic. It has wizards. I mean, it has pretty much everything. There's a love story. There's a very good love story.
Yeah.
There's sex.
Good God.
There's drugs. I mean, there's literally everything in this series.
Air travel.
Yeah. Yes. Everything. There's just everything you could ever want. You will find it somewhere in this series.
It's the perfect desert island.
Yes.
Book series.
Yes,
I mean,
it
it's
is.
because it's everything.
It is.
So
that's kind of my pitch.
Sure. And Tommy Knockers was a miniseries in '97, I think, with Jimmy Smits and Marg Hellenberger from CSI.
Okay.
And yeah, it is basically, like, the plot description on that is, a buried UFO slowly turns local inhabitants into gizmo-building alien mutants.
Okay.
It was from '93.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah. So, anyway.
I've always meant to read it because aliens scare me.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yep. It's on my list. I mean, obviously every Stephen King book is on my list.
Right.
But,
so how does your pitch go?
Okay. So the way that I kind of view it is, and that's a good way to kind of gauge their interest in it and kind of see, like, your idea is to kind of see how crazy they already are.
Yes.
And then push them over the edge a little bit.
Yes.
I like that approach. I'm a little bit more crazy and out there anyway. So, like, I mean, I'm kind of like an obnoxious parent who thinks that their kid or like pet or what have you is like the best ever. So I'm just like, oh, you have to read The Dark Tower.
Yeah.
Kind of my pitch for it is that it is a kind of a lot of what I've already said. It's an amalgam of several different genres. So I don't usually try to ease them into it, but a lot of times I'll, if I'm carrying around one of the books, someone this actually happened quite a bit when we were working security and I was reading it for the first time. People would come by my desk and be like, oh, what are you reading? I'm like, oh, Stephen King. And they're like, oh, scary. And I'm like, it's a teenager falling in love in a Western and an Old West setting kind of thing. Sure. So that's kind of the misconception that a lot of people have, is that Stephen King is strictly a horror writer. Mm-hmm. And the way that you described it is that, yes, he takes characters and puts them into, he creates these ordinary people and puts them into extraordinary situations. And that's what I absolutely adore about his work. Mm-hmm. And to kind of put that a step farther, one of the great things that he does in all of his writing, and I'm seeing a lot more of it, especially now that I've been reading it, a thing that he does so perfectly and wonderfully is that he takes characters that are not only ordinary characters, but a lot of times they're flawed characters. It has Bill Denbrough has a stutter. Eddie Kaspbrak has asthma. Mm-hmm. The list goes on and on. They're flawed characters.
Jack Torrance is an alcoholic.
Jack Torrance is an alcoholic. There are tons of characters that have these flaws that he doesn't use that as he doesn't use that to propel plot. He uses that to really, really, flesh out the characters and use them organically within the plot, use their flaws in the plot. Jack Torrance, like you said, is an alcoholic and he becomes more susceptible to the evil charms of the hotel. Mm-hmm. Carrie is an incredibly damaged teenager who's a victim of her mom's zealotry, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
Who also happens to be telekinetic.
Right.
But with The Dark Tower, it's one of the amazing things about it. If you were to sit down and tell someone about the quartet at the center of The Dark Tower and just say yeah, okay, there's a legless woman from the civil rights era that has a split personality thing going on, mm-hmm. a recovering heroin junkie, and a 12-year-old boy, and this little raccoon that's kind of like a dog that can repeat words to people.
Like a parrot.
And, and then there's also this old gunslinger guy who has no sense of humor and has one goal in his mind: to go to the tower. It's such a the way that he writes characters and the way that he groups characters together, it's such a ragtag thing. Mm-hmm. And The Dark Tower allows him to go a little bit more absurd with that. And it's done in such a way, in such a setting, that it makes you just really fall in love with the characters and the quartet and really go along with their story in such a really, really gripping way. Another example is also The Stand. Oh man. Oh God. What was? Oh,
Nick Andros.
Nick Andros. Yep. He was mute, right? He wasn't just deaf. Yeah.
And he links up with a mentally handicapped guy.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's this is terrible, but together they kind of make one person.
They do. Yeah.
They're a team, but it's it's.
Yeah. God, The Stand is so good.
That's a fantastic one.
Oh man. But yeah, so I basically say that, okay, you have this guy who he is one of the most prolific authors of our time. His name is ubiquitous with horror. He has things that you know his work from either books, movies, television, comic books. He is done. For the few people that are Rock Bottom Remainders fans, he was also in a band. Are you aware of that? Did you know?
No, yeah, no idea.
He and a bunch of other writers formed a band. I mean, I haven't listened. It's not my thing.
Yeah.
But like it's called the Rock Bottom Remainders, and it's
Wow.
I mean, more power to him.
Yeah.
But anyway, like he is ubiquitous with the horror genre, and like people know his name. So when I say that, like my in with that, if I'm kind of going all over the place, but my in with that is if they know the name Stephen King, what do they know about him? Well, he's a horror writer. Okay, well, if you want something unexpected, here's this fantasy series that has like a lot of different elements. There is some horror elements to it, but for the most part, it's science fiction, fantasy, horror, adventure, and just really fascinating character development and world building and stuff. Like, and usually, if you pitch them that, I mean, that could pique their interest enough for them to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
But then the big sell is saying like, okay, and it also interconnects with several of his other books, and it is the linchpin of his entire universe and everything. And he has all of these different elements from other books that come into play into the books, and it just opens up his entire bibliography. I mean, that can kind of scare them away a little bit.
Yeah.
But if you're in it, it's like an incredibly rewarding experience. Yeah. Did I answer the question how I would pitch it?
I think you did.
I feel like
yeah.
I just rambled a little bit. In my brain, I'm just going over The Stand now and how much I want to read The Stand again. Yeah, and we will talk in future episodes about different elements of the book series. These Palaver episodes will be mostly spoiler filled. We will warn you when we spoil it. We will have specific episodes about spoilers that happen in the book series. So, we will definitely let you know ahead of time when we spoil it. Yeah. So how do you respond to people that say like, oh, well, he's just a horror writer?
I would say that he's not just a horror writer. I would say some of his most famous works are rooted in horror. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's the genre that he draws from the most. Mm-hmm. I would say that is true, but he has so many other works that are not horror.
Right. Like you were saying before.
Right.
I didn't mean to make you like.
No, you're fine.
Yeah.
But I mean, and even I think the properties that are horror aren't meant to scare you necessarily.
Right.
I know that, like, for example, Salem's Lot,
mm-hmm.
It's about a vampire, and like an old school scary vampire, not like a shiny Robert Pattinson vampire.
Yeah, like a Nosferatu thing.
Nosferatu type thing. Yeah, it's a monster.
Mm-hmm.
That's without question horror, but my favorite parts of the book are not the horror. It's
mm-hmm.
that wasn't particularly scary to me. It was more interesting to uncover the mystery.
Yes.
And to the building, the world building of the town of Jerusalem's Lot, mm-hmm. Which is the focal town of the story. Just the imagery that King builds in that novel with the kind of the small town life, and you have mm-hmm. these archetypical characters of a small town that are so relatable. And he just builds these pictures in your mind so well. The old man that sits on his porch from sun up to sundown, mm-hmm. cleaning his fingernails with his pocket knife and talking about the old days. Mm-hmm. You have an instant picture in your mind of what that is. And it's written with such wonderful detail and minutia that picture gets color and it has sound, and it's just, it's more than just a picture in your mind. It becomes a story, and it becomes mm-hmm. a character in your mind. It just fills so many different criteria. And that goes beyond genre to me. That makes it more than just horror mm-hmm. for me. I don't mean to just harp on Salem's Lot, but there's a part of that book, I want to say it's about 30, maybe 20 to 40 pages, mm-hmm. where he's essentially going through a timeline of a certain day.
Yes.
And there's no horror in that timeline whatsoever.
Right.
It's just different townspeople in this town during a specific event.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so brilliant how that plays out. It's like you're experiencing the news or something.
Yeah.
Except you're seeing it firsthand. It's not someone recounting it to you. It's just a brilliant stroke of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I think that transcends genre. He does that. That's not something that's unique to horror.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's not trying to scare you when you're reading that. And so I think associating Stephen King with horror or just trying to scare people does a disservice to his value and his talent as a writer. 11/22/63, it's about time travel. There's nothing scary about that.
Right.
Isn't Rose Matter? That one's not scary, isn't that?
I don't know. I haven't read that one.
I haven't read that one either.
Yeah.
I want to say that one's not.
But to kind of leapfrog off of that, one of the great, like the big selling point I would say for The Dark Tower is that, like you described, the world building that Stephen King does. Like you get a sense, like when you're reading Salem's Lot, you're in Jerusalem's Lot.
Yeah.
When you are reading The Shining, you're in the Overlook Hotel.
Right.
And The Stand, you're traveling the country, like seeing and smelling the bodies of just dead people that are just victims of Captain Trips.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had another example, but I can't remember what it was. Like Under the Dome, you get a sense of Chester's Mill. Like what he does so wonderfully is he has such a knack for creating this environment around the story. So like in The Shining, in particular, like there's whole sections where Jack is becoming more intrigued by the hotel, and he's going through old newspaper clippings and stuff, and he's learning about the history of the hotel, and we as the reader are learning about the sinister side of the hotel and what, like, all the evil that's happened there and everything. On the flip side, you get in It, like I mean, there are interludes throughout It where it's one of the characters just telling backstory about the city of Derry, Maine, and like I have maybe a couple hundred pages left of the book, and about 5 hours left of the audiobook. And like, Derry, Maine is a place. Like that's an actual place to me. And he is so gifted at creating this world in each story. And like, that's one of the reasons why I really liked Under the Dome, is because that's like him taking that small town thing and just making this monster of a book about them, like, trapped in there, and like the political structure and everything. It's a freaking phenomenal book. I really need to read it again soon.
Yeah.
But
he kind of creates like ecosystems.
He does,
more than like a world. Or it's kind of, world building is kind of a standard term. It's he like creates an ecosystem. Think of like like the rainforest.
Yeah.
Kind of like that.
Exactly.
All these different levels, and
as hacky and cheesy and cliche as it sounds, the setting is like it's as another character.
Yeah.
But to kind of expand on that, like, think of how well he does that in his stories, and then imagine him creating this entire other universe that's this fantasy landscape that has these, like you said, robots, lightsabers. They have a bunch of stuff thrown in, and just the level of care he brings to the detail of that is just amazing. And Midworld is a really fascinating environment to play in when you're reading it. And to kind of start winding down a little bit, and kind of also branch off from this topic here a little bit, one of the you haven't had a conversation with Mike about Stephen King, have you, recently?
No.
Mike, at all?
No.
Really? Okay, so for our listeners, Mike is our friend who was a regular co-host on The Obsessive Viewer, and then now he just kind of pops in every now and then. But I went down and visited him. This was like 2 or 3 months ago, and in my head, I remembered when it was because I was remembering what book I was reading.
Nice.
From The Dark Tower. So, like, I listened to Song of Susanna on the way there and back because he lives a few hours away.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I was deep in my reread of The Dark Tower, so I was basically nerding out with him about it. He revealed to me that he's not a big Stephen King fan. And it's not that he doesn't like Stephen King, and it's not that he doesn't respect Stephen King. He has a ton of respect for Stephen King and what he does. He just can't get past the kind of monotony of his writing.
Okay, I totally understand that.
Oh yeah.
Totally get it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's such an interesting conversation to have with him, and maybe someday we'll have him on here to talk about his feelings on Stephen King, but it's fascinating because the things that he can't connect with or doesn't want to or isn't that doesn't the things that don't work with him are exactly what works with me.
Okay.
And it's fascinating to talk to him about it because he's like, oh yeah, it's going through pages and pages and pages of just monotonous stuff that's not, and I'm like, oh, I like that because that is him fleshing out the characters and stuff. And it's like, yeah, I get that, but it's just not for me. And so when I was reading book 7, there's a whole, I basically was listening to the audiobook, and I basically had come home from work, got made dinner, ate my dinner, and then cleaned the dishes and everything and put everything away and all that. And then I realized during that entire time in book 7, that entire time that it took me to do that in the audiobook, King was writing about, Pimley Prentice in the Devar Toy.
Okay.
In Algol-Ciento.
Yeah.
Basically going through his day. And that's as much as it was that amount of time. I made myself dinner and ate it and then cleaned up, and he was still talking about his day. And I was just I was kind of fascinated by that. And so I sent him a message saying oh, hey, I basically said that. And while that character does play a pivotal role in the book, that's the introduction of his character.
Yeah.
In the 7th book of a 7-book series.
Right.
It's really fascinating. But if you're into that type of level of detail to characterization, it's something that will work really well for you.
Yeah, and I have that same notion. Pimley Prentice rambling. Is he the one who gives them a recording of a tape that they listen to as well? No, that's Ted Brownigan. Ted Brownigan, yeah.
Pimley Prentice is the head of the Algol-Ciento.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Gosh. See, I'm a big fan of this series, and I can't keep everything straight.
Right.
Still. I mean, that's... Anyways, there were times during the 7th book while I was listening, and I was like, can we just get to the damn roses, please?
Yeah.
Cross the field of roses and fight the frickin' guy. Come on.
Yeah.
It drives me nuts. And I totally get that, but then I'm sitting there listening to Ted Brownigan tell his story, and he's getting weaker and weaker, and...
Yeah.
I'm like, man, this is actually really interesting. You think it's a sidetrack, and it bothers you for the first couple paragraphs, the first even couple pages. But once you get past that, you're like, okay, now I care. Now I want to know. And that's how I react to it.
Yeah.
But I can completely understand why Mike or other readers would be like, no, you're slowing this down. We need to not cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Just get back on track.
Sure.
And so I completely empathize with that. I completely get that, but I find myself more often than not enjoying those sidetracks or enjoying that extra bit of development or depth. I find myself enjoying that and getting involved in it and investing in that.
Yeah.
But that's just how I react, you know. I get it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why it's such a struggle to transfer the books, transfer his written work to the movies and
Absolutely.
TV. Because I feel like whether it's because of studio interference or people that just don't understand what's so appealing about his writing, but more often than not, you kind of get, from my perspective, you get filmmakers that are taking the material and saying okay, this is what makes it scary. Oh, there's ghosts in a hotel. Let's just put them that's not a good example, but let's go ahead and run with that and like make a scary movie of this, when it's more like, okay, well, Jack is an alcoholic and he's being seduced by the hotel, and it's like he's slowly succumbing to that, to where he wants to kill his family. Like there's a nuance to that there's a nuance to his storytelling that gets so overshadowed, it feels like.
Right.
Like I haven't seen the It miniseries in a long time. Like before recording I said that I hadn't seen it, but I actually remember I saw a lot of it when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And like I feel like maybe part of the miniseries, I don't know if I'm curious to see if they got the nuance into the characters or not, because I mean, you think of It, you think, oh, Pennywise the Clown. You don't think of,
right.
the Losers Club is this really interesting set of characters.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that nuance, I think what you're trying to describe with that, which I think you described it really well.
Save.
No, you did. I'm not, I'm trying, if you want to see that, see that nuance, watch Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and then watch the miniseries with Stephen Bauer.
Yeah, Stephen Weber.
Yeah. Thank you. Two completely different interpretations of that book. Both good, but both good in different ways, I think.
Yeah.
And I think the one with Stephen Weber's the miniseries is a little more true to the book.
Yeah.
Whereas the movie takes it to just a different level.
Right.
And I think they're both good in their own respects. And, Stephen King doesn't care for the Stanley Kubrick's version.
Right.
That's his opinion.
Sure.
But like I think you can, what you were describing with the difference, the variance and nuance between the horror and, nuance.
Yeah.
And
characters.
Other characters and stuff like that. Yeah. You can really tell in those two different adaptations of that same story.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It helps that I believe he wrote the script for the miniseries.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
I think so. I think so. And I like the miniseries. I really like Stephen Weber as him. And again, his performance in the It audiobook is ridiculous. It's so good.
That's so great.
Yeah. So kind of the last thing, how do you pitch it to people who saw the movie and are still curious about it or confused about it?
Mm-hmm. I would say just forget the movie. Mm-hmm. Forget everything you saw. Mm-hmm. Just forget it all. Seriously.
That just makes me think of forget everything you think you know about Midworld. Okay, done.
Done. That's great. But no, I would say if you didn't like the movie, that does not mean you won't like the books. Mm-hmm. If you loved the movie, you can still love the books.
Yeah.
Like the movie is completely inconsequential when in regards to your enjoyment of the book series, I think, because it's just such a drastic, I would say misinterpretation of the books,
right?
But a drastic interpretation of the books, drastically different from the books, that it just won't have an effect on that.
Yeah.
Don't base your potential enjoyment of the book series on your reaction to the movie.
Right.
I would say that. Honestly, it's as simple as that. I don't need to elaborate.
Right.
From there, I would go into a pitch of why the book series is so great. Mm-hmm. I might devolve into a essentially reductive rant about why the movie was so bad.
Right.
But which is almost inevitable. But I would ultimately try to steer that person towards the series, because their reaction would be totally different.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, I'd feel the same way. I would just say, hey, what elements of the movie did you like? Oh, the gunfights were pretty cool. And, that's about it.
Yeah.
Then just be like, hey, go from there. If you liked the idea of a tower in the middle of everything, kind of keeping away darkness and everything, even though that's a little bit different from how it is in the books, if you like that as a concept, you'll really love the idea of the Dark Tower as a book series. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I feel like we should, it's funny. I feel like we could have had a lot more to say about that, but I feel like we've said our piece about the movie.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about the movie anymore, really.
I'll probably put together some kind of episode of us talking about it, because I'm not going to subject you to talking about the movie again.
I don't think it deserves that much analysis.
I honestly...
It'd be like Summer of Sandler.
Oh yeah,
which is a series we for those of new listeners who are not familiar with the Obsessive Viewer. It's a series we did where us and our Mike, aforementioned Mike, watched every Adam Sandler movie.
Yeah,
talked about them.
That was a struggle.
And at the end of it, I said, I don't think these movies deserved that kind of analysis.
Right.
And that's exactly how I feel about The Dark Tower.
Yeah.
I'm done analyzing it.
As the movie.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. The movie.
Yes. Yeah, because I hope you didn't mean like The Dark Tower as a series. Cause then,
that's how I feel about Akiva Goldsman's The Dark Tower.
Yeah. Although I do have an idea. I don't know how much time you would be able to devote to this.
Okay.
But there is a 119-page draft of the script for the Dark Tower movie from 2014. I read about 60 pages of it, and a lot of the elements from the finished movie are there. Like it's focused on Jake and stuff like that, but I went into it expecting like they didn't change it. They didn't change anything for the final movie and all that. But like I was reading, I was like, why didn't they do this? Like why did like this actually would have been acceptable. So my idea is like we could both read it and then sit down and palaver about the script, and that would be our kind of way to talk about the movie without talking about the movie.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know. I'll send it to you.
I think I might be game for that.
Nice. Yeah, I'll send it to you, or you can just type in Dark Tower movie script 2014.
Okay.
Matt Hurt's tears. But it's funny because like in the aftermath of the movie, I just thought like Akiva Goldsman he's forgotten the face of his father. He's dead to me. But reading that, I was like, I mean, there's stuff in like it's much more truer to the books.
Okay,
like much more.
I'm
still a little different, but much more in tune with it. So yeah, we'll have an episode about that. I did mention this in my review with Fecus, which by the way, Fecus is our friend Robert Fecus. He is hopefully going to be involved in our book discussions. As the idea is that our Kef episodes are going to be us going through the book series part by part for each book, and Fecus has not read the series. He's only read the Gunslinger, I think, a couple times, and he hasn't read anything more. So we're going to have him on with us to discuss it as someone who hasn't read it. So stay tuned for that probably after a while. But anyway, I'll leave you with this because Tiny, I haven't had a chance to tell you this, but I went and talked to one of my former coworkers, and I was telling him about the Dark Tower movie and how disappointed I was and everything. And then like he actually said, well, look at it this way. And granted, this doesn't really translate because the comparison he's making is for something that's like an institution and has much more weight than the Dark Tower and arguably even Stephen King. Well, definitely Stephen King. But he said, look at it this way. We had to suffer through Batman Forever and Batman and Robin before we got Christopher Nolan in the Dark Knight trilogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just like, that's funny that's really great for a couple reasons. One, that gives me some optimism in this hour of need that I'm in. And two, guess who wrote Batman and Robin? Yep. Akiva fucking Goldsman.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, I don't know. We'll see what the future holds, but yeah. Is there any are there any parting thoughts that you want to give off in this first official episode of Tower Junkies?
Yeah. Other than if you're joining us listening to this episode in the hopes of being convinced to read, being successfully pitched to read the series, please read it. And
yes,
like you heard what we said, please, if you haven't read it yet, go read it and please contact us. Like we totally encourage interaction. Email us, anything. Hell, start your own podcast or something, and we'll come talk on it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, you can do what Matt does with an anthology and just read through it for the first time as a completely new listener
that'd be awesome.
or a completely new reader, and just say your thoughts week to week or month to month about what you're reading. We totally support that idea.
Absolutely.
So yeah, please read it and get involved. Let us know how you would pitch it if you're a big fan of the series already.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, by the way, if you want to contact us, by the way, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/TowerJunkiesPod. Follow us on Twitter at TowerJunkiesPod. Follow us on Instagram at TowerJunkiesPod. And, just go to the website, you guessed it, at TowerJunkiesPod.com. And you can also email us at matt@obsessiveviewer.com or tiny@obsessiveviewer.com. And, just give us your feedback. One of the things that I haven't really expressed this to you, Tiny, but I have a feeling that you're going to feel the exact same way. And I think you kind of mentioned something similar to it at some point. Kind of the idea behind this podcast and the idea that I'm running with personally is that Tiny and I have known each other for a very long time, and we have spent a lot of that time talking to each other about the Dark Tower. And we know people who like the Dark Tower. We've I have a bunch of Dark Tower shirts. I like to wear them and stuff. I've had people point out to me oh yeah, Dark Tower and everything. But we want to have conversations with other Dark Tower fans.
Yes.
I'm really hoping we've both proclaimed it to be our favorite thing, and I want that to be something that we can share with our listeners. So feel free to give us a call. Feel free to email us, tweet us, all that good stuff. And we would love to talk to you about it. And then in the future on the podcast, as I said in the previous episode, we don't really have a, set release schedule. We're going to shoot for definitely minimum one episode per month. On the 19th of each month, you'll see an episode. But I'm sure that we'll have more episodes in between and everything. But coming up on the podcast, we're going to be doing a lot of different types of episodes. The way that we've had this designed is that we're going to have a bunch of different types of episodes, books related to the Dark Tower, the actual Dark Tower books, non-Tower Stephen King books, movies and adaptations, and any TV or movie adaptation news for the Dark Tower itself. We have a bunch of different categories and everything. So coming up, we'll eventually do a 2014 screenplay draft review, and then eventually we'll start our reading of The Gunslinger. But I think sooner rather than later, we will likely do a few episodes, probably 3 episodes for it.
Yeah, could easily do 3 episodes on it.
Yeah, just because. Well, the idea is that we'll have one episode talking about the book, and then at least we'll do one episode for the miniseries, and then one episode for the movie.
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll figure it out. Yeah, and so that'll be coming soon. Yeah, anything else?
I think that's it.
Oh my God, that's awesome. We just recorded our first not Obsessive Viewer podcast together.
Yeah.
That's not anthology, but anyway. Yeah, so yeah, thank you guys for listening, and long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for listening to Tower Junkies, a Dark Tower podcast presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find more of our episodes at TowerJunkiesPod.com, and you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can find ways to do that at TowerJunkiesPod.com/donate, or become a patron for Obsessive Viewer at Patreon.com/ObsessiveViewer for recurring donations with different reward tiers. Every donation goes toward paying the fees to keep the podcast running and is greatly appreciated. Any and all feedback on the podcast is encouraged. You can contact us by emailing us at matt@obsessiveviewer.com, or by tweeting us at TowerJunkiesPod or at ObsessiveViewer and at ObsessiveTiny. You can also like us on Facebook at facebook.com/TowerJunkiesPod. For more podcast content from ObsessiveViewer.com, check out Anthology, my solo side project podcast where I'm reviewing The Twilight Zone as a first-time viewer and exploring other classic and contemporary science fiction anthology television shows. You can find Anthology at anthologypod.com and anywhere podcasts are found. Finally, if you're philosophically curious, check out Tiny's side project podcast, The Secular Perspective, which explores the concepts of faith, religion, and existence from the perspective of secular hosts Chad and Amanda. You can find that at thesecularperspective.com and subscribe to the podcast on the app of your choice. Once again, thank you for listening to Tower Junkies, and we'll see you next time.